You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hi, everyone. Today, I want to do something a little bit different. I'm going to introduce you to another art show that I love, and I think you'll love it too. It's called Arts Educators Save the World. I think the title pretty much says it all, but just in case you aren't sold yet, let me tell you why this is a podcast we all need in our lives. Arts Educators Save the World brings together successful artists and their mentors for a conversation about arts education. The show features amazing guests like the composer and musician Lin-Manuel Miranda, the actor Bradley Whitford, ceramicist Sharif Bey, comedian Cecily Strong, and many others who all say the arts educators made them who they are. The show reminds us that arts educators are superheroes, and the work we do today can change someone's whole life. In this episode, we're going to hear from the multimedia artist, teacher, and all-around awesome guy, Carlos Gacharna, who speaks with his own high school ceramics teacher, Geof Hermann. They dive into all things clay-making, glass-blowing, making work in Brazil, and how art education classrooms can be a life-saving space. If you like the episode, check the link in the show notes to find Arts Educators Save the World on your favorite podcast app. And of course, be sure to follow them and leave a kind rating or review.
This is Arts Educators Save the World, where successful artists and their mentors talk about how arts education transformed their lives. Welcome back to Arts Educators Save the World, a podcast where artists and their mentors talk about the impact of arts education on both their lives. Today, Alec and I are stepping outside of our comfort zone to talk with two visual artists who are ceramicists, glass artists, multimedia makers of artworks, none of which Alec and I can do. So,
hey, look, I can't even pretend. I literally have no nouns to help me pretend that I can do any of those things.
Well, let me give you a few 50-cent words, and I want to give our audience a few words that I learned that you'll hear throughout the podcast that are specific to the medium of clay making. So they talked about my favorite word, pugging, which is when you take the clay that you don't use in an object and then you remake it so that it is usable again. They used the phrase trim a nice foot, which I also really liked, which I think has to do with the bottom of a pot. When you're making a pot, the bottom of it is called the foot. And they also used the phrase raku firing, which is a particular way to fire a piece of clay in, I think, an outdoor oven, an outdoor kiln that requires a particular kind of expertise. And I mention all that to say how much I really enjoyed today's guests, artist Carlos Gacharna and his mentor, retired high school teacher Geof Hermann, talking about the specifics of the form of clay making as a way to know and a way to learn. We had a lot of really incredible conversations about the relationship, not just between artists, but between artists and materials and ideas, and the role of embodiment, of using your body in the way you make art, and how much that has inspired Carlos in his career, both as a professional artist, which he is now, and as a teaching artist, which is a really lovely aspect of this relationship. Not all of our artists who we interview go on then to become teachers themselves. In fact, most of them are in fields that don't require regular teaching, but Carlos is a teaching artist. And so his reflections on this relationship with his teacher, Geof, and with the materials and tools is both about his art making, but also about himself as a teacher. One final note before we start, you'll hear a few audio glitches throughout our discussion. Don't worry, no one is being abducted by aliens. Should we get into it?
I was just going to, I was going to say that trim a nice foot is also where I get my pedicures. Did you want to start the show? You can go ahead from there.
Welcome, everyone. I am going to take the pleasure of introducing our artist guest, and then he is going to get the opportunity to introduce our special guest star today, his mentor. So first, I am so thrilled to introduce Carlos Gacharna, born in Bogota, Colombia, moved to my hometown of Madison, Wisconsin when he was 7 years old. Is it a hometown? My adult town. My adult town, that sounds weird too. The town I live in and call home, Madison, Wisconsin, when he was 7 years old. In high school, he started exploring the visual arts and specifically ceramics, which we will talk much more about in the coming hour. He attended the University of Wisconsin at Madison, my current place of employment, where he began to explore other media, including glassblowing, and neon glass bending and blacklight photography. And in his time at UW-Madison, he also became a teaching artist where, fun fact, I first met young Carlos Gacharna, teaching artist, when he was designing, running, and funding his own artist-in-residence programs through the Madison Public Library's Community Maker programs. He also spent a year living in and making art in Brazil, which I can't wait to hear more about. And since 2017, Carlos has been a working artist and a teaching artist in Long Beach, California, down the block from Alex's adopted town. He runs an after-school teen program for Artworks LA. He teaches littles at Angels Gate Cultural Center, and he makes incredible multimedia art that you can find on his website that leverages all of his skills with clay and glass and much, much more. Carlos, I'm so thrilled that you agreed to join us on Arts Educators Save the World. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Erica. It's a pleasure to be here.
All right, your turn.
Of course. And it's a pleasure to introduce Geof. So I wrote a little thing and it said, there's no one recipe for the art of education. But when I reflect on the imprint my high school ceramics teacher, Geof Hermann, left on me in my approach to classroom management, I think of high expectations, a comfortable learning environment, and room for self-guided exploration. We're all familiar with the concept of a helicopter parent, but Geof to me was a quintessential potted plant parent. Always there if you needed anything, but gave plenty of space and never ruled with an iron fist. He tolerated my heavy bass music at full volume, taught me the value of education beyond a grade, and opened many doors to travel, create art in nature, and even set me up with my first gig as a cashier for a local potter. As a matter of fact, he's the reason I received my high school diploma on time. I bombed my final math exam, and my math teacher refused to sign off on my grade so I could complete my credits and walk on time with the rest of my grade. Thankfully, I had completed a ceramics independent study I'd never turned in for credit, so Geof quickly helped me with my paperwork, and I got to graduate on time. If that's not a testament that anything is possible through art, I don't know what is. All this to say, it is my pleasure to introduce my ceramics teacher and mentor, Geof Hermann.
Thank you, Carlos. That's really kind. I had forgotten about the that credit snafu. So yeah, thank
sure
you.
That happened.
Yeah. And you're still talking about it, Carlos, so it didn't traumatize you too much.
Nah, I mean, can't say I remember the name of that math teacher, but here we are, Geof.
That's right. That's right. So I want to kick things off with both of you telling me about the first time you remember working together. It's okay if it's not the same story. In fact, sometimes that's quite delightful. But I want to hear a little bit about the origin story of Carlos and Mr. Hermann.
Hey, Carlos, could I start?
Of course.
Okay. All right. So I was thinking about this a little bit. How did my first memories of you? I recall you being a quiet, studious, thoughtful, completely committed to learning, in the ceramic studio. You slowly opened up, blossomed as you became more comfortable with the space. And I know that it was very important for me as a teacher. There are a lot of different approaches, and the approach of being a guide on the side was how I would approach things. I thought the most important relationship to occur in the room was not the relationship between the students and I, although that's crucial. But I thought at the very most, students had to develop or find a relationship with the materials and the ideas. And as you became comfortable in the space and you realized there was a lot of latitude, your presence became more impactful, more powerful. You were more engaging, seeking me out. The one image that comes back to me is when you said you were willing to do some of the pugging, and the pugging is the machine that we would take scrap clay, we'd throw it in this large barrel, and there were these big impeller blades that would spin around, and there is an art to it, to pugging clay that is of quality so that it can be used. I just remember once you learned how to use the pugger, you were always pugging. I could always rely on you to make clay, and not only make clay, but make good clay. And that really meant a lot to me because the pugger was a fair amount of my energy and attention. And you were one of those students, one of those rare handful of students that just could read the clay and make it well. So that was one thing that I thought of. And then I have a few videos online of students at work, and there was one video where I was interviewing Johanna Hansen, who was making this octopus sculpture. It's so interesting because I can hear you in the background, and you're giving advice to other students, and they're really good advice. And there's a second teacher in the room. It's not just me. That was a great discovery for me because I recently reconnected with Johanna, and I shared that linked with the video interviewing her as she's making art. And that's when I heard you in the background, and you were moving around the room and providing all this wonderful assistance to students. And so in essence, you clearly made a good choice in the path of your career, helping people out in the creative realm. So bravo for you. And I'm honored that we share that profession. So I'll leave it at that, but I have many other memories too, but those two came to mind, and I hope they're a good share.
For sure. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's just interesting kind of hearing back on it. I feel like I wasn't fully self-aware at that age, so I had no idea. But I joined ceramics when I was a junior in high school. And when I was a little kid in Colombia, my favorite thing was just using like colored Sculpey clay. And I would make like little dinosaurs and whole worlds. But I think that when I moved to the US, I was just so focused on like assimilating and all that. It kind of got put on the back burner, and I kind of just use it for projects. But then junior year came around, and I was like, hey, I'll take ceramics, just give it a shot. It was kind of something that I connected to. And then within 2 weeks, literally all my free time, I had double lunch, I had an early release, all of it. And I was just there every day. And that was the first time that I ever worked on a project, not for the grade, but just for like my own satisfaction and sense of learning. And I remember I completely restructured my schedule because I was on like a total slacker schedule. But then I was like, ceramics kind of just taught me to understand and value education. And at that point, I was like, okay, well, I'm on a track to go to the UW through people program. I might as well earn it. That kind of just sparked me getting into like double AP, macro and microeconomics. I was taking 3 English classes at one point. And all of this really came as a result of kind of that ceramics thing. But I was in a situation where most of my friends are older, or they were alternative kids that ended up at the alternative high school. So by junior year, most of my friends are gone. And so that ceramic studio, and this is something that I share with a lot of career artists, I think. It really became like an art as a survival strategy, because that was the only space that I felt comfortable being myself in. And I think of Memorial High School very much as like a 1980s high school special kind of high school. So it's very jocks and cheerleaders, and you got your science kids and your theater kids. And I wasn't any of those. But I think having the ceramic studio, and it was homey, and you can make a mess, and you can also like spread out, and it gave me something tactile to do, I think was essential to my development. And I'm not sure what would have happened had I not found the art department.
I don't know if you recall, but I went to Memorial High School too, and I graduated from that same school. For whatever reason, I didn't feel comfortable in many spaces in that school, but I recall walking through the those two front doors that led to the art campus or the art space. And every time I walked through those doors, I would just feel all this weight just drop off my shoulders. And it was just a safe place and a place where I felt good and I felt comfortable and I liked what I was doing and there was a purpose to it and I had some control over it. I wasn't just regurgitating things, and I think we had that in common. And I also do recall you being in there a lot.
Yeah.
I had other students that did that
Definitely.
as well, and I never mentioned that because I just felt I'm just going to enjoy this. It may be a fad and run its course, and after a couple months or a couple weeks, I don't see them anymore. But there are some students, some special students, you being one of them, who just really made it your space. And we just cohabited and we worked together and shared ideas. And I may have directed some of the assignments, but I always felt there was enough latitude in every assignment that people could interpret it and find something that was meaningful and personal. And the more the connection the student had with the artwork, the more valuable and meaningful it was. So, and you were stellar in that, Carlos.
Yeah, I did 8 semesters of ceramics in 2 years. So
Wow.
yeah, and like Geof mentioned, part of it was even doing an independent study, just learning
Yeah.
like the technical aspects and how to like maintain the equipment and everything. And that was essential because when I got to college, literally that next semester, my first 2 jobs was working as a, in GED, helping adults get their high school diplomas, and then being the shop
Yeah.
tech at a ceramics studio. So there was that immediate
Oh.
connection to both of those aspects.
So I do not know much about ceramics other than as a consumer. And 2 years ago, we spoke with Bill Strickland and one of his former students, Sharif Bey, who's an artist and a ceramicist. He works at Syracuse University. They talked a lot about throwing and the art of throwing pots as a particular form of practice that inspired them both. And I'm wondering if you all can talk a little about the particulars of your practice and your practice together. And are you throwers or are you 3D art makers or both? And when you say you did 8 semesters in 2 years, was it all of those things? Like, I'm super curious about the tactileness of it all.
When I think of ceramics, I think of 3 main art forms. So there would be like hand building, which is you're just using your hands, you're making sculptures, whether that's free form or, etc. There's wheel throwing, as you mentioned. And then the third one, which is what I would identify as most now, and that's something that I tapped into in college, would be mold making. And that is using what's called a porcelain slip or like liquid clay to create a cast of something using a plaster mold or a different kind of mold. I kind of moved through those 3 forms. You kind of unlock different skills along the way, but wheel throwing is really kind of like the most famous branch, if you will. I think perfection paralysis is such a thing for my whole generation and the kids that are coming up right now. And I remember being in Geoff's class and like, I didn't finish a single wheel thrown thing in 6 months. I would just work them until they fell apart. So I think that the act of letting go and not having full control, that element of ceramics was very important to me beyond just like the tactile component. It's interesting. We started with wheel throwing, and Geof could probably speak to this. I think what I really became passionate about towards the end of my time at Memorial was glazing and getting like these big kind of drippy, like glassy drips. And if you look at things from, a chemistry point of view, it's all silica, but essentially like glaze and glass are almost the same thing. And so I was already kind of playing around with glass before I even realized it. So it was all kind of like the similar journey to this glazy colored surface.
And you mentioned the 3 forms of ceramics. And I think adorning the surface could actually be the 4th form, the glazing that you're talking about. And it's interesting you mentioned glass and the relationship with glass to ceramics. My mother is a ceramicist, and she's been producing for over 50 years. And her professor at the University W-Madison was Harvey Littleton, whose father worked with Corning Glass. And Harvey Littleton actually began the glass program at UW-Madison, and Dale Chihuly was one of his students. So there's that connection between glass and ceramics can be pretty direct and immediate and strong. And I also wanted to just reference, from a teaching standpoint, teaching ceramics I really appreciated what it allowed me to do as an educator. A lot of learning in school is done through the ears and the eyes. And in ceramics, it's really a lot of learning is through the hands. And there's a good portion of our brain is dedicated to sensitivity and our fingers and manipulating things with our fingers. So I just felt that in this space, students were able to utilize this learning quality that wasn't being exercised really anywhere else in the building. So I felt that was a really important skill or perception or perspective to provide. A lot of times when I was teaching throwing on the wheel, I would encourage a student to not look at the piece, just close your eyes because it's the information coming through your fingers. That's what's really relevant. There's this thing called the sensory homunculus, and it's a human being, and the proportions of this human being are based upon how much of the brain is dedicated to that parts of the body, and the hands are huge. And so I always felt that school needed to emphasize learning through the hands more, but the one space in Memorial where I could assure that it was happening was in the ceramic studio. So I really try to emphasize that. I feel like that's a secondary value of ceramics or any sort of art form, is that it develops a person's sensitivity to stimuli. And so anybody who takes art classes and who is an artist, when they engage the world through their senses, they tend to pull a little bit more away. And so the experience may be a little bit deeper or a little more rich, or they have a little more information to respond to or to engage with. I guess that's sharing a little bit of sort of some of the emphasis behind how I taught and what I taught. And I'm glad to hear, Carlos, that you didn't keep a lot of pieces, because that was a really hard thing when the student throws something on the potter's wheel for the first, second, third, 20th time. It's imbued with this value. Yes, it might have the curvature of the bowl, but when you cut it in half, all of a sudden you realize that the lip is maybe 1/8 of an inch thick, and then the foot is like 2 inches thick. And the interior arc is really not an interior arc, but more like just kind of a inverted triangle or something. Anyway, I'm glad. I think that's really healthy. And the more I keep people not wishing to keep their first few forms and cutting them in half, there was a lot to learn by looking at that form cut in half. So that was an important learning experience. Do you recall what some of the forms that you made early on and how you felt about them? And
Oh, geez.
how'd you develop your connection with throwing?
That's so interesting. I mean, I remember the very first piece that I made was like this little mask with like leaf hair. And I must have spent like 40 hours on that thing. But getting to ceramics, I just remember like my second year with you, I was like really fixated on like these bowls and like learning how to like trim a nice foot. Then, yeah, just these different glaze combinations. Like you said, with ceramics not being precious, that's something that I learned in glass as well, because glass has preciousness and this fragility to it. But if you work with glass, things smash all the time. But I think learning, I was also making really tiny things, because I remember like my first solo show, and I'm snitching on myself right now, but when I got to college, my first solo show was like making tons and tons of shot glasses, even though I was underage, and I sold all of them. So that was like one of my most successful shows. But I definitely started making tiny things in that ceramic studio. But when I think of like what are the most memorable experiences, the raku firing, it was like being an assistant with wood firing and learning those whole processes. I think that kind of like the applied chemistry component, that was really interesting to me. I'd actually forgotten how much time I'd spent making clay for you, but it's all coming back now. And again, it's just kind of like the tactile learning experience. And like you said, I've been working with court-involved incarcerated youth for like 12 years now. And I think that the deeper you go, the more undiagnosed special needs there are. At this stage, like I think I've had more access to resources for working with kids like autism and different like learning styles, whether it's like auditory, visual, tactile. I think I'm very tactile. I think those were really fundamental experiences for me in just making learning accessible to others. But yeah, like you said, it's just learning to let go and making process-based experiences. That is really like the root of my practice with students. It's not so much about the destination. It's just like, we're just going to have this moment and whatever comes out is sweet, but let's just make sure that this right now feels good. And then the rest is whatever.
I just want to point to, you've said so many things that ring true, and I really wish I had met you both about decades ago. I definitely still have the pinch pot I made in second grade. I've kept it. It's so precious to me. This one little, the first bowl I made, I do. The only one. I think I still have that. Eric and I went to elementary school together, and we had the same shop teacher. And so it's interesting what you say about how different it is to be dealing with something purely tactile in school. Because right now, as I try to think back to like, what did I do in math in second or third grade? It doesn't really come into my head. And I loved math, and I was very good at math. I have the clearest memory in the world of the lump of clay, and you guys will know whatever this tool is called, the wire that is used to cut it so that the teacher would give us, Miss C, I want to say, would give us our little bits of clay. And I remember the smell of it and the slip and the kiln. It is like, I haven't thought about it in so long, but it is 100% in my head. I could recreate it completely in a way that I can't recreate things that are just these intellectual pursuits.
I mean, the fancy theory words for that it makes me think of is this.
Please help.
Well, no, it's this notion of embodied cognition, right? Which is that knowing, which we tend to think of as a thing that happens inside your head. There is a lot of knowing, and not knowledge like information, but ways of knowing that are embodied in our actions. And, as a performing artist and as certainly not professional, but as somebody who danced a lot, there is an embodied knowing in dance, in using your body for expression. And there's a different kind of embodied knowing in working with any sort of making, but, clay has particular properties, physical properties, but Carlos, as you've been saying, also chemical properties that have a knowing in them. And so Alec, it makes me think of that. And actually, just for Geof and Carlos, Alec is not only a professional ASL translator, but he makes bilingual theater art with deaf actors and voiced actors. There is nothing more embodied than an ASL actor communicating, complex emotions through their faces and their hands. And so all of these embodied cognitive practices, for me, is part of what makes this podcast and what makes this world so important to me, and which is what makes it world-saving, right? Because of all the humans who have this embodied cognition, and that may or may not translate into what we consider sort of school success or academic success, but all have their own forms of knowing and doing and being and valuing.
Thanks for sharing that about Alec. That's fascinating. I'm glad to know that. I wonder this, Erica, I would ask you this question. So with throwing on the potter's wheel, in the beginning, every step is thought through, and the artist is making conscious decisions on how they're applying pressure and how much water they do the wheel. But at some point, through enough repetition, that shifts into the no mind, where they're not thinking about it, and it's just sort of kind of a flow to it, and they're just basically reading the pressure and the wall thickness of the clay, and everything else is sort of happening automatically, or because it's such a trained exercise of this muscle memory. How does that fit into the cognition that you're discussing?
Oh, that's such a great question. I mean, immediately what I thought of were practices like reading or computation, where for those of us who know how to read, it is impossible to remember what it feels like to not know how to read, because you look at text and you process it. You process it without any explicit reflection or steps. And the same is true for certain forms of mathematizing. You don't even think about it, really, and you complete the equation, complete the practice. So I think of it very much like that, right? I don't know if you remember, it's not so near in my mind. My daughter is 18, but I don't know if you remember the painful 5-year-old or 6-year-old conversations with your kids where you're like, but you just said the word boy. How can you not look at that same word on the next page and know what that is? Which is why I'm glad I'm not a reading teacher. But it feels very much to me like what you're describing, Geof.
Yeah. And I think in the realm of art, not to say it's any different realms that you mentioned, but that when you have a no-mind approach, then there are additional avenues for artist intervention, so that there's an emotional component to it. The artist is expressing something, so they're wondering how this form altering and changing and adding texture to and dealing with mass and negative space, it becomes actually a form of communication. Maybe higher level or higher functioning thinking skills are being involved. Maybe not, I don't know, but they're surely more personal. And so that as a teacher, I would see that. I would see students who would belabor things initially. And if I was fortunate and had the ability to work with a student like Carlos over multiple semesters, I could see this evolution where they would shift from being an artist who's sort of agonizing over the individual steps as opposed to sort of guiding the process and the materials towards this outcome where there was some form of expression, an idea, an opinion, a place. So to see that shift was always a really exciting and rewarding aspect of being a teacher in a room surrounded by young artists who are evolving. I hope that makes sense.
I mean, it absolutely makes sense. And Carlos, do you, as either a former student or as a teacher yourself, do you remember those moments? Do you think about that shift from the sort of technical making to the creative making?
What I think about is really just getting out of your own head and kind of the self-consciousness of learning and like the ugliness of it, and to transitioning to being able to enter into a flow state. As you develop your skills and get a little more confident, get out of your head a little bit, you can tap into that flow state a little easier. Well, that's why I didn't keep anything for 6 months because I was in my head about it. But at a certain point, your hands do what you want them to do, and then you can kind of just like zone out and, produce. That is, something that comes, like you said, Geof, with just dedicating the time to really learn the skills so you can kind of turn off the intellectual part and just kind of feel and flow as you produce.
In theater, that makes me think of improv very much, right? Which is that one of the great gifts of improv as an art form is nothing is permanent, right? You create characters, you work a scene, and then it just goes away. Sometimes that happens in front of an audience, which is different than, right, unless you were doing demonstration work, which I know some people do, right, as a form of performance. But I love this idea of kind of rejecting the preciousness of making, but also embracing the end of it as sort of part of the work rather than like, it's done and here's my pot. It's like, oh no, I'm cutting it open to see what I can learn from that. And that's the end. And then it gets pugged. Pugged? That's my new word that I've learned.
Yeah.
Usually by Carlos.
By Carlos. Now I know.
And recycle it, and then some other kid. Well, that was the thing too, is learning how to mix the powders and the liquids and to do all the stuff to make something new. So that was a fun part for sure.
Yeah, I would always emphasize that when something didn't turn out, then that was an opportunity for learning. And I tried to encourage students to like really embrace. And I never called them mistakes, but when things don't turn out the way that they had intended them to, that's when true learning is made available. And through just dealing with that concept or issue that they're struggling with, that's how you grow and evolve and have a deeper understanding of what you're working on and what you're working with. And so I try to de-emphasize that things were mistakes, but that they were learning opportunities. And really, when students would say they would come up to me and they would say, hey, this isn't working out, Mr. Hermann. I would just celebrate that. So, that's really wonderful. Now you're in a spot here where you get to learn something by solving it. And then we talk about different ways to think about it. And I had a professor at the university, Doug Marshallek, who I really respected on so many levels. And one thing I learned from Doug was that when I would ask him questions, he would never give me an answer. He would just provide me with maybe 3 or 4 different ways of looking at it. And I recall other students in my class, they were disgruntled because it's like, he didn't answer the question. And I realized that his answer wasn't important, but encouraging me to think about things in different ways and just looking at the universe and pulling down these possibilities, that made life so much more interesting and rich. And I will always respect him for that. And I try to do that as best I could with my classes, is to leave a lot of latitude for students to explore and have these discoveries.
Carlos, can you tell us just a little, in the time we have left, a little bit about glass and the photography that you do? Because as much as I know nothing about ceramics, I've at least held clay in my hand in a making space-ish. I can't even fathom these other things that you do. Tell me things.
Absolutely. So it was really interesting hearing Geof mention that he considered his classroom a laboratory, because the other art classroom that was incredibly impactful in my journey was the glass lab at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, which is ran by Helen Lee, who's also an incredible mentor of mine. But that was not a glass studio. They weren't there to teach you how to make vases and, like pumpkins or all these things. It was very much like, let's see what we can do to push the medium forward and really kind of enter the realm of the conceptual. And I think there's always been this connection to science. And when I was 16, I did an internship at the water ecology department of the UW, and they had me digging up larvae from Lake Wingra or for dragonfly larvae, because they're ecological indicators, and if they're gone, that means the ecosystem's collapsing. And so that was great, but I learned that people don't pay you for the experiments, they pay you for the data. And if you're not good at making those graphs and those charts, then maybe you're not the best scientist. But I've always been interested in science. And so just to be in an art program where it's like, we are here to essentially just push the boundaries of human understanding. And that really kind of gave me a camaraderie with scientists. And to this day, what I'm doing is essentially applied science. So we're looking at blacklight to do this photography, or like neon. Again, it's gases, neon, argon, xenon, all these different things. That's a lot of the conversations that I'll bring into my classrooms, as well as I'm teaching these kids while we're doing a fun project. I'm teaching them about fluorescence. I'm teaching them about kinetic energy, essentially using art as a vehicle to teach life skills. Yeah, it's all rooted in process and material exploration. So the blacklight photography, that's a whole body of work that I call Between Heaven and Earth, which are metaphors of explorations of energy as a metaphor for spirituality that can't be created or destroyed. It can only change phase, right? So we're capturing moments in transition, kind of these ephemeral moments, and doing that through photography or videography. I just did a piece. We projected it probably like 30 feet wide on the side of an army barracks here in Southern California. And that did also incorporate text, which is, kind of like my protest art practice. But the visual hook is the videography, because it's kind of pushing people's expectations for reality a little bit, especially with little people. If you bring in like a huge black light and some glowing dyes, and things are moving and flowing in ways that you've never seen in person before. And I think that is, like, as an educator, the biggest thing that I can do for you is to just kind of reframe reality a little bit and get you to kind of think, be a little more curious around the world around you. And if I can do that, then I've done my job, and whatever else is whatever else.
Geof, can you say a little about, well, first of all, would love to hear what kind of art you are making, but also I know you have had this other teaching mentorship life with Bethel Horizons. Can you say just a little bit about that and about your own art practice?
Yes, I can. Talk a little bit about Bethel Horizons. My ceramics mentor was Don Hunt, who taught at West High School. I had him as my practicum teacher at the university, and then I enjoyed working with him so much that I manipulated the system so I could have him as my cooperating teacher for my student teaching experience. And I learned a lot from Don, and there's so many things I could say about it, but I really appreciated that he had high expectations for his program and for his students. he would move heaven to make things happen for his students in his program. And I realized that as an art teacher, I don't have to be passive or complacent, but that I can ask for assistance, I ask for help, I ask for resources. So that he instilled in me, like, to have high expectations and really make that happen. And I was Don's substitute, or not substitute, I'm trying to think of the title itself, but I was his support when he taught a week-long course every summer at Adama Studios up by Bethel Horizons. And Adama is a subdivision of Bethel Horizons. And the last year that I was his workshop assistant, and the workshops would have about 25 to 30 people in them, and they would be a range of from beginners, neophytes to professionals and everything in between. So the instructor really had to have a range of skills and abilities and different techniques for transferring information. So it was impressive to see him teach. And the second year that I was his assistant, I got a phone call about a week prior to the beginning of the workshop, and Don explained to me that he had just been diagnosed with the stage 4 glioblastoma. I think I may be saying that wrong, but a brain tumor, and that he wouldn't be able to do the workshop. And he asked me if I would take it over. And Don passed away about 6-7 months later. And I taught Don's workshop for the next 14 years. I had about 28 to 30 people involved in that workshop almost every summer, with a range of skills from newbies to professionals. And that was a great experience. And that ended with COVID. I had an opportunity to teach at Edgewood College with David Smith when he went on sabbatical. That was the semester that COVID hit. So that was interesting because I had to turn a ceramics class from being in person to online. It was quite a challenge, and I had to drive clay and tools to people's houses just to make sure that they had everything that was necessary. But anyway, and then this last semester I had the opportunity to supervise UW Art Ed students while they're doing their last semester working with cooperating teachers as student teachers. And that was really valuable for me. As a great way to utilize all the corpus of knowledge and experiences I had as a art teacher. I would visit them as they were teaching 2 or 3 times a semester, follow it up with various conversations with them and their cooperating teacher. And it was a really just wonderful way to use my prior experiences. I was surprised the experience of retiring is all of a sudden you just sort of disappear, and I didn't necessarily want to do that. And I think of the Japanese practice of when somebody who's skilled retires, who is skilled and retires, the government finds a stipend for them so they continue to work with young people who are following them, whether it be a skill or a tradition or whatever. And that doesn't happen in this country. All this institutional knowledge just sort of disappears unless someone writes a book or whatever. That's my experience. Yeah.
And Carlos, I am super curious about what you've taken now as a teaching artist. So you're a professional artist, and we've talked a little about how the practices that you learned have translated into your professional arts practice, but you're also yourself a teacher and a teaching artist. And so what have you taken from Geof's pedagogical practice? And I think it's sort of apt, Geof, that you talked about, the challenge of retiring and some of that institutional knowledge not following you, because I think sometimes it follows in the folks like Carlos, right, who learned to be a teacher from you and who are now doing that. So Carlos, I'm interested in that.
For sure. So I will mention one really concrete example and then kind of talk a little bit about the soft skills. But so the Bethel Horizons, I think doing these weekend retreats where you're in nature and you just disconnect from everything and you're just working with clay. I didn't really know it at the time, but that is essentially part of a greater craft school movement. And there's these craft schools scattered across the country, whether it's Pilchuck or Haystack or even more urban ones like Pittsburgh School of Glass. And we're in a really interesting moment right now. There's a nonprofit called Crafting the Future, whereas essentially it's contemporary glass blowers, fiber artists, ceramicists of color that are kind of having success in the fine art world right now. And they put together this nonprofit, and they've been taking groups of students from the inner cities to go have these experiences. So they're taking kids from LA to go to the mountains in Maine to go make art and build community and all that. I got in contact with that crew through my glassblowing network, which is interesting that's that triangle with your mom and Harvey Littleton, because that's
right.
Helen's glassblowing studio. But they gave me a grant for $10,000 this year to do essentially a contemporary crafting residency with my high schoolers. And then we're going to take a group of high schoolers and alumni to craft schools next summer. So essentially, it's my turn to take it to the woods now. And I probably wouldn't have been doing that if it wasn't because of you. So there's that, which is like a really concrete thing. But in terms of like the soft skills, I think the biggest takeaway that I've had from working with Geof is just the power of creating a comfortable learning environment. And I think there's like a lot of research that's coming out where it's like if your fight or flight response gets triggered, I'm probably butchering the science, but it's like learning shuts down for 20 minutes. And I think, especially working with kids going through trauma or through crisis, again, I've worked with incarcerated youth, kids in like youth shelters that are going through like the worst week of their lives. And to just be able to step in and create a personal connection and help them lower their guard a little bit so they can actually learn and be present in the moment. I think that was absolutely just from hanging out in the ceramic studio and being able to pick the song. I still do that with my students. I let them pick their songs and all that. I am essentially a potted plant parent now. And so, yeah, it takes one to learn from the next.
I do recall you bringing dubstep in, and you would burn me dubstep CDs. You remember that?
And play it real loud.
And Cowboy Bebop. Yeah, I actually learned a lot from you. Yeah,
for sure. The seatbelts. Yeah, it's a great band.
Yeah.
Last thoughts, either of you, or anything you'd like to ask the other person that we haven't really gotten to or talked about?
I did want to ask one thing. COVID's a tough cookie, so we don't got to get that deep. But I did want to ask you, because you're the first real artist athlete that I met. And, we have this interesting, I kind of consider myself an artist athlete now. And there's a few other, like my friend Alev Kelter, she just won bronze in the Olympics for women's rugby. And we were in glassblowing together. And I think we're like very similar, kind of like squirmy, can't sit still sort of folks. And so I just wanted to ask you about kind of the connection between art and athleticism and how it feeds your practice.
One of the best things you can do for your brain is to move. The brain is sort of the genesis of a lot of the creativity. So it's taking care of your body is really helpful. I always have this extra energy, and it's nice to have a creative outlet with it. So I used to be a competitive runner, and then I went into competitive snowshoeing, and now I race canoes. And I like having competition is really interesting. I don't always win, sometimes, but not always. But I like the training. I like the discipline. I heard a quote recently that said, "Discipline is freedom." If you can stay with something and follow a regimen, that you can actually accomplish more and get more out of it. So, and I was really glad to see that you're taking care of yourself physically. I've seen some of your posts, and that really matters a lot. And the work that you do now physically in your 20s and 30s, that's kind of foundational, and your body doesn't forget that. It'll stay with you. So anyway, I was really glad to see that because I think it's really healthy. And it also, I'm 65 years old and I'm not done yet. And there are a lot of things that I'd like to do that require physical strength and conditioning. And it's more of a struggle now as I'm aging. I think the whole process of aging is probably the most interesting experience I've ever had in my life. It's not always a pleasurable one, but I'm really glad I took care of myself when I was younger, because that's helping me navigate that.
You mentioned about teaching online and COVID and how just wild that experience was, because, like 2020, I got laid off of both of my jobs, and essentially what brought me back to work was teaching online classes, specifically for third graders. And so I went from, I taught 12 online classes in 2020, and all of a sudden I was teaching 9 to 12 a week. And I never seen such creaky 8-9-year-olds. And so what I started doing is I started teaching them stretches and eventually incorporating breath work. And so that's what I do with my third graders now is like especially these early morning classes, we start with like a stretch, and essentially I'm like teaching them these tools that will help them down the line, especially if they're trying to be a professional artist. And in this past year, I started making my high schoolers do it too, because I thought they would be resistant to it. But it's been so interesting to see how ready this generation is to learn kind of these like these maintenance practices, if you will. So that's a large part of my practice now is like, okay, we're gonna do this breath work, we're gonna do these stretches. That was actually something that I learned in Brazil as well. As I took this life drawing class, and some of the most interesting things I learned in that class was, one is how to draw with your whole body, but also how to sit properly at a desk so that you're not getting repetitive stress injuries. And I think that is like a really valuable tool to share with students as well, is you don't have to destroy your body just by being an artist.
I like hearing that. I like hearing you say that. It's just the idea of teaching them about stretching and physical strength. I think that you can do that because you can explain that really well. And I think that your success as a teacher is that you explain things well and students trust you. You understand the value of it and they're willing to listen to you. And I think that's the key to being a really good teacher, is you've won their trust over. Yes, you are teaching art. I was teaching art, but it was really teaching about life. And the more that you could expand it out and incorporate other elements with the visual arts, the more relevant and meaningful and rich it became for them.
Thank you.
The greatest compliment I ever got, I think, from a student for a class was that, Mr. Hermann, you're not teaching art, you're really teaching about life. And I thought, bingo, that's exactly what it is.
Absolutely. To me, art is a universal language that anybody can understand, regardless of like race, class, social status, etc. But what I tell folks, like the three main things that I'm trying to teach, it's knowledge of self, it's communication skills, and it's cultural literacy. So like being interested in the world around you, knowing how to express yourself, and then just learning how to value your own identity, but utilizing art to accomplish those goals.
Carlos, what else do you do as you're teaching, but outside of that, what are some of the other interests in your life that you're pursuing?
Oh, geez. I mean, well, financially, I also bartend events, but really that's always been adjacent to like organizing. And I think that curating has, that like, I remember you invited me to have an art show at Memorial, and I was like, well, I'm already doing these art shows downtown. So I think like the organizing component is like really like crucial for me. And I think that like entering the LA ecosystem, you kind of have to put that on the back burner, just because you are a medium-sized fish entering the ocean, if you will. But I'm in a position now where I'm getting access to spaces and I have won people's trust. And so now I think it's time to a greater emphasis on organizing events and getting to cultural event making here in like the LA ecosystem. But that was like a huge part of my 20s in Madison. So definitely that, and then just riding bikes and cooking and hanging out with my friends. All those things as well.
I'm going to take the privilege of the end here and say that all of these conversations are special to me for many reasons. And this conversation is particularly special because my own daughter, who passed away 10 years ago, was also a student of Geof's and was also the reason she went to school. And it's funny that you mention, and I've thought about process and product. We do have multiple of her pieces in our home. And that has been an unexpected gift that she did make and keep. Many of those, I don't know if they were first pieces. Katja also, like Carlos. Thank you. I mean, I think she was also I don't know what you called yourself, like an ultimate perfectionist, whatever. She also probably worked things until they fell apart. But we do have those pieces. And it's really special for me to hear the two of you talk about this, helix journey that the two of you have been on together, and know that Katja was spinning a little bit in that helix of that relationship. So thanks to the both of you for that. We're also
both prickly teenagers making art in our own little corners of that studio at the same time, for sure.
I have a bowl that Katja gave me was a bowl that she was really happy with how it turned out with the glazing. And it's in my kitchen, and it's used from time to time. And every time I pick it up, I think of Katja. And that's interesting. We make these artifacts that could exist for 500,000, a million years, So these are things that we give to the future as well.
You know what really struck me about that conversation, Alec, was the multi-generational storytelling around mentorship that was embedded in there. I didn't know, obviously, as you heard, I've known Geof Hermann because he was my daughter Katja's teacher, but I didn't know that he also went to Memorial High School. He also stepped foot into that ceramic studio as a student. His mom was a ceramicist and a glass artist. And so she learned from the people who started the glass program that Carlos then went to. And so there's like the literal multi-generationalness of that I appreciate. But then there's also this kind of historical passing on of ways of knowing and doing and being that are cycled through Geof's experiences, to UW, to Carlos's experiences, and now he gets to bring a group of students to one of those very studios himself. We talk a lot about the one-on-one relationship between an artist and their mentor, but this conversation really built out a whole world of folks who embody a way of knowing and doing that they pass on through time to other folks. And I just found that really inspiring and moving.
And I'm still sitting here with memories of my elementary school. What did we call it? Shop. We call it shop. And what's definitely sticking with me also is, granted, our school was a magnet school, was different than the typical New York public school, but it was a public school. It was not a private school. I mean, the fact that a lot of schools here don't even have nurses' offices always strikes me as insane. But the fact that we had an arts room, an art studio, we had one class for art in one place, and we had one class for shop, which was woodworking and clay, in another place, and a science room in another place. And these were normal to us at the time, but really, no, I didn't become a ceramicist, and I could almost knock two 2x4s together-ish, sort of. But that we had those, that schools that allow you to experience that from a young age are special. And my goodness, I don't remember the smell of my math classroom, but I remember the smell of the shop and the feeling I got walking in there. Very special.
And I want to add that by special, I don't think you mean precious. In other words, Madison Memorial High School is a public high school in Madison, Wisconsin. It's not a special school, right?
Right.
But it's special because over multiple generations, that learning space has maintained its status as a sacred ground for students like Carlos, who said, like, literally, this saved me from dropping out of school, to students like you who maybe it didn't save you, but you maintained that in your heart as a place where you learned things that you otherwise would not have been able to learn.
And I'm an artist. I mean, it's not that art form, but of the options that were given to me in a school that was very heavily academic and very math and science centered, I didn't take to that. I took to the art side of things, and that I got to go to a place and see that those are just as respected. In fact, you could say more so, because you're just sitting in your classroom to start your math, and now we're going to talk about history, but you go somewhere. You go somewhere special to do theater and to do art and to do clay, and that was meaningful to me and continues to be.
I love that idea of art making as a sacred place. And I think that really came through in this conversation.
Absolutely. And so let's talk about art making here, because I've got this question I've been meaning to ask you, Erica. My question to you is this: if you, we've been talking about a lot of clay, but I got to say, I was very taken with any discussion of glass, and we're going to talk more about glass as the weeks go on. But it's so mystical to me. And so my question is, if you were a glass, let's get the right verb here, blower, maker, artist, I don't know what the word is, but if you could do that thing, what would you make out of glass?
A gigantic eyeball.
1.
A car that I could take my cats for a walk in.
None of that made sense. 2.
Yes, and me. It's improv.
And none of that made sense. 2.
A clock where you could see the mechanism working all the time.
Yes, and I want you to make me one of those 3 things.
Great. Well, since I was so generous to share my ideas about innovation in glass with you, I'm going to ask you for 3 ways that our listeners can help enhance the Arts Educators Save the World experience.
All right, I'm not going to innovate at all on this one. Number 1, please follow the show in your podcast app.
1.
2, please rate the show. Really helps us get seen when those rating numbers get nice and exciting.
2.
And review the show. Tell us what you love. Tell the world what you loved about Arts Educators Save the World so they can come and love it too.
3 things. Talk to y'all soon. Onward together.
Arts Educators Save the World is hosted by Erica Rosenfeld Halverson and produced and co-hosted by me, Alec Lev. Our executive producer is Doug Matica, and our audio producer is Justin Asher. Special thanks to our collaborators, the brilliant and talented Kate Baldwin, and our great friends at Story Pirate Studios, Lee Overtree, Benjamin Salka, and Amy Fiore. Original music is by Dan Lipton, and our artwork is by Lyra Evans. Check out our website designed by Cole Locasio at www.artseducatorspodcast.com. We are on Instagram at Arts Educators Podcast, and you can write to us with your questions and comments at contact@artseducatorspodcast.com. You can also find us at a place called YouTube. And wherever you're listening, please remember to subscribe, rate, and review. It really helps the show. We're proud to be sponsored in part by the University of Wisconsin-Madison and the Gibb Faculty Fellowship. Arts Educators Save the World was created by Erica Rosenfeld Halverson and Alec Lev.